I was standing in my driveway in Scottsdale, Arizona, staring at the bright red propane tank next to my outdoor kitchen, when I noticed Patricia Hoffman from the HOA marching toward me with that familiar pinched expression that meant trouble was coming my way. "Excuse me, Yates," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "We need to discuss this eyesore you've created on your property." I straightened up from where I'd been admiring my handiwork and turned to face her. The afternoon sun beat down on us both, and I could already feel the tension building. "What eyesore would that be, Patricia?" She pointed dramatically at my propane tank, the one I just spent 2 hours painting a nice bright red with yellow safety stripes. "That monstrosity. You can't just paint things whatever garish color you want. This is the Sonoran Hills community, not some trailer park." My jaw tightened at her condescending tone. "It's a propane tank, Patricia. I painted it according to fire safety standards. The red indicates it's flammable gas, and the yellow stripes are for visibility." "I don't care what you think it indicates," she snapped, pulling out her phone and taking several photos. "It's a violation of our HOA covenants." Section 12, Paragraph 4 clearly states that all exterior features must maintain a neutral, desert-appropriate color palette. That means beige, tan, or light brown. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You want me to paint my propane tank beige?" "I want you to paint it a color that doesn't stick out like a sore thumb and ruin the aesthetic harmony of our neighborhood," Patricia said, her perfectly manicured nail tapping against her phone screen as she typed something. "You'll be receiving a formal violation notice within 24 hours. You have 7 days to remedy the situation or face fines starting at $250 per day." Before I could respond, she turned on her heel and walked back toward her white Mercedes SUV, leaving me standing there in disbelief. My wife Lauren had warned me that buying a house in an HOA community might come with headaches, but I'd never imagined they'd have a problem with basic safety measures. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with Lauren, explaining what had happened. She shook her head, her dark hair falling across her shoulders as she leaned forward to look at the HOA covenant book I'd pulled out. "This is insane," she said, flipping through the pages. "They can't seriously expect you to paint a propane tank beige. That's a safety hazard." "According to Patricia, aesthetics trump safety," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "I spent good money getting that tank installed and painted properly. The company that set it up specifically recommended the color coding." Lauren pulled out her laptop and started typing. "Let me look up the actual fire codes for Arizona. There has to be something that overrides the HOA rules when it comes to safety." While she searched, I walked over to the window and looked out at my backyard. The outdoor kitchen had been a dream of mine for years. I'd finally saved up enough to have it built, complete with a built-in grill, pizza oven, and all the fixings. The propane tank was essential for the whole setup, and I'd made sure everything was up to code when I had it installed. "Found it," Lauren called out. Arizona Fire Code, specifically NFPA standards. They actually recommend color coding for propane tanks and other hazardous materials. Red is the standard color for flammable materials, and yellow markings enhance visibility for emergency responders. "So I'm actually following proper safety protocol," I said, feeling vindicated. "More than that," Lauren said, turning her laptop to show me the screen. "In some jurisdictions, it's required, and even where it's not required, it's strongly recommended by the National Fire Protection Association." I grabbed my phone and pulled up the email for Dominic Ramirez, the contractor who'd installed my outdoor kitchen and propane system. I needed documentation from him about the safety standards he'd followed. The next morning, just as Patricia had promised, I found a certified letter in my mailbox. The violation notice was printed on official HOA letterhead, complete with photos of my propane tank and a detailed description of the alleged violation. The letter cited Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the covenants and gave me 7 days to repaint the tank in an approved color or face daily fines. I immediately called Dominic. He answered on the third ring, and I could hear the sound of power tools in the background. "Yates, hey man, what's up?" he asked cheerfully. "I've got a problem with the HOA," I explained. "They're saying my propane tank color is a violation and want me to paint it beige." There was a long pause. "You're kidding me." "I wish I was. Can you send me documentation about the color coding standards you followed? I need to fight this." "Absolutely," Dominic said, and I could hear the indignation in his voice. "That color scheme isn't just recommended, it's industry standard. I've been installing these systems for 15 years, and every single one gets painted red with safety markings. I'll email you everything I've got, including the NFPA guidelines and the manufacturer's specifications." "Thanks, Dominic. I really appreciate it." "No problem. And Yates, don't let them bully you into creating a safety hazard. That beige paint they want. It makes it harder for firefighters to identify hazardous materials in an emergency. I've seen houses burn down because emergency responders couldn't quickly identify where the gas shutoffs were." His words stayed with me as I hung up. This wasn't just about HOA aesthetics anymore. This was about the safety of my family and my neighbors. Within an hour, Dominic had emailed me a comprehensive packet of information. It included excerpts from the National Fire Protection Association standards, manufacturer recommendations, insurance company guidelines, and even testimonials from fire departments about the importance of proper color coding. Armed with this information, I drafted a response letter to the HOA. I explained that the color coding was a safety measure recommended by fire safety professionals, backed by NFPA standards, and that painting the tank beige could actually create a hazard. I attached all of Dominic's documentation and requested a hearing before the HOA board to discuss the matter. I hand-delivered the letter to the HOA office, a small building near the community entrance. The office manager, a tired-looking woman named Sandra, accepted my letter and promised it would be given to the board. "Off the record," Sandra said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "I think you're right about the safety thing, but Patricia doesn't like to be challenged, especially not by residents." "Is she on the board?" I asked. "She's the president," Sandra said with a weary expression. "Has been for 6 years. Nobody else wants the job, so she keeps getting re-elected." That explained a lot. I thanked Sandra and left, hoping the board would see reason. 3 days later, I received a response. The HOA denied my request for a hearing and insisted I comply with the original violation notice. The letter was curt and dismissive, stating that HOA covenants took precedence over suggested guidelines, and that my time to comply was running out. I was furious. Lauren found me in the garage, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "They denied the hearing," I told her, showing her the letter. "They don't care about fire safety. They don't care about professional standards. They just care about their precious beige uniformity." Lauren read the letter, her expression growing more concerned. "This is ridiculous. We need to escalate this." "To who?" "They control the neighborhood." "To the fire department," Lauren said firmly. "If the fire code actually recommends this color scheme, then the fire marshal needs to know the HOA is trying to force you to violate safety standards." It was a brilliant idea. The next morning, I called the Scottsdale Fire Department and asked to speak with someone about residential fire safety. After being transferred twice, I ended up on the phone with Fire Marshal George Whitmore. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Marshal Whitmore said after I'd explained the situation. "Your HOA is demanding you paint your propane tank beige, despite the fact that you've color-coded it according to standard safety practices." "That's exactly right," I confirmed, "and they're threatening daily fines if I don't comply." "That's concerning," the fire marshal said. "The color coding you've described, red for flammable materials with yellow visibility markings, is absolutely the right approach. It's recommended in NFPA 704 standards and helps emergency responders quickly identify hazards during an emergency response. So I'm not crazy for thinking this is important. Not at all. In fact, I'm concerned that an HOA would try to override basic safety practices for aesthetic reasons. Would you mind if I came out to take a look at your setup?" I gave him my address immediately. "Please do. I'd appreciate a professional evaluation." Marshal Whitmore arrived that afternoon in an official fire department vehicle. He was in his mid-50s, with graying hair and the solid build of someone who'd spent years in physically demanding work. He walked around my propane tank, examined the color coding, checked the installation, and took several photos. "This is textbook perfect," he said, pulling out a measuring tape to check the clearances around the tank. "Whoever installed this knew what they were doing. The color coding is clear and visible. The installation meets all safety requirements, and honestly, this is exactly what we like to see in residential setups." "Can you put that in writing?" I asked. "The HOA won't listen to me, but maybe they'll listen to the fire marshal." "I can do better than that," Marshal Whitmore said, pulling out a business card and writing something on the back. "I'm going to send a formal letter to your HOA explaining why this color scheme is recommended, and why painting it beige would be inadvisable from a fire safety perspective. I'll also note that if there were ever an incident at your property, the lack of proper hazard identification could be cited as a contributing factor in any investigation." Relief flooded through me. "Thank you so much. I was starting to think I was fighting a losing battle." "HOAs can be tricky," the fire marshal said, "but safety codes exist for a reason. They're written in blood, as we say in the fire service. Every regulation came about because something went wrong somewhere. The color coding standards came about because firefighters were getting hurt or killed when they couldn't quickly identify hazards." He spent another 20 minutes going over various aspects of my outdoor kitchen setup, offering some additional safety tips, and explaining how emergency responders would approach my property in an emergency. It was incredibly informative, and I felt more confident than ever that I'd done the right thing. 2 days later, Marshal Whitmore emailed me a copy of the letter he'd sent to the HOA. It was professional and thorough, explaining in detail why the color coding was important and strongly recommending that the HOA reconsider their position. He'd also copied the letter to the Scottsdale Fire Department's legal department and the city's code enforcement office. I forwarded the letter to the HOA office and waited for their response. Surely they couldn't ignore the fire marshal, right, wrong. The next morning, I found another letter in my mailbox. The HOA had not only rejected the fire marshal's recommendations, but had doubled down on their position. They claimed that the fire marshal's letter was advisory only and didn't constitute a legal requirement to maintain the current color scheme. They also informed me that since my 7-day compliance period had ended, I was now being fined $250 per day until I repainted the tank. I couldn't believe what I was reading. They were actually going to fine me for following fire safety recommendations. Lauren was equally outraged when I showed her the letter. "This is insane. They're choosing aesthetics over safety, and now they're going to bankrupt us with fines. $250 a day adds up fast, I said, doing the math in my head. That's $1,750 a week, $7,500 a month. We can't afford that, Lauren said, her voice rising with stress. But we also can't paint the tank beige. What if something happens? What if there's a fire and the firefighters can't quickly identify the hazard? I pulled out my laptop and started researching Arizona HOA law. There had to be some recourse for situations like this. After an hour of reading through statutes and case law, I found something promising. Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33-1600. I read aloud. HOAs cannot enforce provisions that violate federal, state, or local law or regulations, and they can't enforce provisions that are in direct conflict with health and safety requirements. But they're claiming the fire marshal's recommendations aren't requirements, Lauren pointed out. True, but the fire marshal specifically said that painting it beige could be cited as a contributing factor in an incident investigation. That implies there could be legal liability if we follow the HOA's demands and something goes wrong. I needed a lawyer. This was getting too complicated to handle on my own. The next day, I met with Victor Chen, an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Scottsdale, a modern glass and steel building that looked out over the desert mountains. This is an interesting case, Victor said after I'd explained the situation and shown him all my documentation. The HOA is on shaky ground here. While covenants generally are enforceable, they can't require you to do something that creates a safety hazard or violates professional standards. Can we fight this? I asked. Absolutely. I'd recommend we do several things. First, we send the HOA a cease and desist letter explaining that their enforcement action is creating potential liability for both you and the association. Second, we file for an injunction to stop the fines while this is being resolved. Third, we prepare for the possibility of taking this to court if they don't back down. How much is this going to cost me? Victor leaned back in his chair. I'll be honest with you, Yates. HOA litigation can be expensive, but given the documentation you have from the fire marshal and the NFPA standards, I think you've got a strong case. I'd estimate between $5,000 and $10,000 if it goes to court, but there's a good chance we can resolve this before it gets that far. It was a lot of money, but so were the daily fines. And more importantly, I was right. I knew I was right. Let's do it, I said. Victor got to work immediately. Within 2 days, he'd sent a comprehensive cease and desist letter to the HOA, outlining all the reasons their enforcement action was improper and potentially illegal. He cited the fire marshal's letter, NFPA standards, Arizona HOA law, and even threw in some case law from other states where HOAs had lost similar disputes. The response from the HOA was swift and hostile. Patricia herself called me, her voice dripping with venom. "How dare you threaten this association with legal action?" she hissed into the phone. "We have every right to enforce our covenants, and your little lawyer tricks aren't going to change that." "Patricia, this isn't about tricks," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "This is about safety." The fire marshal himself said the color coding is important. The fire marshal doesn't live in this community. He doesn't have to look at that eyesore every day. Our residents expect a certain standard of appearance, and you're bringing down property values with your garish paint job. Bringing down property values? It's a propane tank behind my house. Most people can't even see it. "I can see it from the street when I drive by," Patricia snapped. "And if I can see it, others can too. You need to comply with the covenants you agreed to when you bought your house, or face the consequences." The consequences of following fire safety recommendations. The consequences of violating HOA rules, she said, and hung up. I stood there holding my phone, shaking with anger and frustration. This woman was willing to force me into a dangerous situation just because she didn't like the color of my propane tank. Victor filed for an injunction 2 days later. We had a hearing scheduled in front of a Maricopa County Superior Court judge in 3 weeks. In the meantime, the HOA continued to assess daily fines, which were now approaching $5,000. The stress was affecting every aspect of my life. I couldn't sleep properly, and I was constantly worried about the mounting fines and legal fees. Lauren tried to keep my spirits up, but I could see the strain on her face too. "We could just paint it beige and be done with this," she suggested one evening, though her tone made it clear she didn't really think that was the right answer. "And then what?" I asked. "We just let them win. We accept that an HOA can force us to ignore safety standards because of aesthetics. What's next? They tell us we can't have smoke detectors because they're not beige." "I know," Lauren said softly. "I know you're right. It's just so much stress." The weeks leading up to the hearing were tense. I gathered more documentation, got written statements from Dominic about industry standards, and even reached out to the National Fire Protection Association to get an official statement about their color coding recommendations. The NFPA sent me a detailed letter explaining that while color coding wasn't always legally required, it was strongly recommended as a best practice. They also noted that many insurance companies gave discounts for properties that properly color-coded hazardous materials because it reduced risk. That last point gave me an idea. I called my homeowner's insurance company and spoke with my agent, Melissa Warner. "I have an unusual question," I said. "Does your company have any policies regarding the color coding of propane tanks and other hazardous materials?" "Let me check," Melissa said. I could hear her typing. "Actually, yes. We recommend following NFPA guidelines for hazard identification. It's not a requirement for coverage, but properties that follow these guidelines are considered lower risk." "Why do you ask?" I explained the situation with the HOA. There was a long pause. "They want you to paint it beige," Melissa asked, disbelief clear in her voice. "That's the opposite of what we recommend. If you did that and there was an incident, there could be questions about whether you'd taken reasonable safety precautions." "Could you put that in writing?" "Absolutely. I'll send you a letter today." Another piece of documentation for my growing file. Victor was pleased with everything I'd gathered. "This is excellent," he said, reviewing the insurance letter. "We're building a case that shows painting the tank beige isn't just aesthetically unpleasing to you. It's actually creating a safety hazard and could impact your insurance coverage. That's solid grounds for an injunction." The day of the hearing arrived. Lauren and I dressed in our best professional clothes and drove to the courthouse in downtown Phoenix. Victor met us outside, carrying a thick briefcase full of documents. "Remember," he coached me as we walked inside, "the judge is going to ask questions. Answer honestly and directly. Don't get emotional, even though I know this has been frustrating. We want to present facts, not feelings." The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected and fairly informal. The judge, the Honorable Margaret Springer, was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. The HOA was represented by their attorney, a slick-looking guy named Robert Devereaux, who wore an expensive suit and had the kind of practiced smile that never reached his eyes. Patricia sat behind him in the gallery, her arms crossed, and her face set in a permanent scowl. Judge Springer called the hearing to order and asked Victor to present our case for the injunction. Victor stood and launched into a clear, concise explanation of the situation. He presented the fire marshal's letter, the NFPA guidelines, the insurance company's recommendations, and the documentation from Dominic about industry standards. He argued that the HOA was attempting to force me to violate best safety practices and create a potential hazard. Your Honor, Victor concluded, my client has done everything right. He installed his propane system according to code, had it professionally painted according to industry standards, and received approval from the fire marshal. The HOA is attempting to override all of this because they find the color aesthetically displeasing. But safety must take precedence over aesthetics. We're asking for an injunction to stop the accrual of fines while this matter is properly litigated. Robert Devereaux stood to respond. Your Honor, with respect to opposing counsel's arguments, this case is quite simple. Mr. Zanders agreed to abide by the HOA's covenants when he purchased his property. Those covenants clearly state that exterior features must maintain a neutral color palette. He violated those covenants. The fire marshal's letter is advisory only and doesn't constitute a legal requirement. The HOA has not only the right but the obligation to enforce its covenants uniformly among all residents. Judge Springer leaned forward. Mr. Devereaux, are you arguing that HOA covenants can require residents to ignore fire safety recommendations? I'm arguing that fire safety recommendations are not legal requirements, Your Honor. Mr. Zanders's propane tank is code compliant regardless of its color. The safety argument is a red herring. This is about aesthetic standards that all residents agreed to maintain. Your Honor, if I may, Victor interjected. The safety argument is not a red herring. The fire marshal specifically stated that painting the tank beige could be cited as a contributing factor in an incident investigation. That creates potential liability for my client. Judge Springer held up her hand. I've heard enough for now. I want to ask Mr. Zanders some questions directly. I stood up, my heart pounding. Mr. Zanders, the judge said, why did you choose to paint your propane tank red and yellow, Your Honor? I followed the recommendations of the professional contractor who installed the system. He explained that red indicates flammable materials and yellow markings improve visibility for emergency responders. I wanted to make sure my property was as safe as possible for my family and for any firefighters who might need to respond in an emergency. Did you consider the HOA covenants when making this decision? Honestly, Your Honor, no. It didn't occur to me that there would be a conflict between safety standards and HOA aesthetics. I assumed safety would take precedence. And if I don't grant this injunction, what will you do? I glanced at Victor, who gave me a subtle nod. Your Honor, I'll continue to refuse to paint the tank beige. I can't in good conscience create what I believe to be a safety hazard, regardless of the fines. Judge Springer nodded slowly and made some notes. Then she addressed the HOA's attorney. Mr. Devereaux, has your client considered any kind of compromise in this matter? We've offered Mr. Zanders several options for screening the tank from view, Your Honor, but he's refused all of them. This was news to me. That's not true, Your Honor, I said quickly. No one has offered me any alternatives. Judge Springer's expression sharpened. Mr. Devereaux, the attorney looked uncomfortable for the first time. I may have misspoken, Your Honor. The board discussed possible alternatives, but I'm not certain they were formally communicated to Mr. Zanders. I see. The judge made more notes, and I could tell this hadn't gone well for the HOA. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm granting the temporary injunction. The fines will be suspended pending further proceedings. However, I'm also ordering both parties to attend mediation within the next 30 days. You need to figure out a reasonable compromise that addresses both the HOA's aesthetic concerns and Mr. Zanders's legitimate safety considerations." She banged her gavel. "Court is adjourned." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. At least the fines would stop accumulating while we figured this out. Patricia stormed out of the courtroom without looking at us, but I could see the fury in her rigid posture. Robert Devereaux gathered his papers quickly and followed her out. "That went well," Victor said with a satisfied smile. "The judge clearly thinks you're in the right, and calling out their attorney for misrepresenting the facts was a nice bonus. Judges don't like that." "What happens in mediation?" I asked. "We'll sit down with a neutral mediator, and they'll try to help both parties reach an agreement. Given the judge's comments about compromise, I think the HOA is going to have to be flexible. They can't just demand you paint it beige anymore." The mediation was scheduled for 3 weeks later at a mediation center in Scottsdale. The mediator was a retired judge named Harold Fitzgerald, a grandfatherly man with white hair and a patient demeanor. We all sat around a conference table. Me and Lauren, Victor, Patricia, Robert Devereaux, and 2 other HOA board members I'd never met. Harold explained the mediation process and emphasized that everything said in the room was confidential and couldn't be used in court later. "Now," Harold said, "let's start by understanding what each party really wants. Mrs. Hoffman, why don't you explain the HOA's concerns?" Patricia launched into a lengthy speech about neighborhood aesthetics, property values, and the importance of uniform standards. She showed photos of other houses in the neighborhood, all with their carefully maintained beige and tan color schemes. "We've worked hard to create a beautiful, harmonious community," she concluded. "And then Mr. Zanders comes along and paints this garish red and yellow tank that you can see from the street. It's disruptive and sets a bad precedent. If we let him violate the color standards, what's next? Pink houses, purple fences." "Mr. Zanders, your perspective," Harold asked. I took a deep breath. I understand the desire for aesthetic consistency, but this isn't about me trying to be rebellious or make a statement. This is about following professional safety standards that protect my family and my neighbors. The fire marshal said the color coding is important. My insurance company said it's recommended. The contractor who installed it said it's industry standard. I'm not willing to compromise my family's safety for aesthetics." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "It seems to me that you both have legitimate concerns. Mrs. Hoffman, the community's appearance matters. Mr. Zanders' safety is paramount. The question is whether we can find a solution that addresses both needs." "He could screen it," Patricia said immediately. "Put up a fence or wall to hide it. Would that be acceptable to you, Mr. Zanders?" Harold asked. I thought about it. "That depends. If the screening is tall enough to hide the tank, doesn't that defeat the purpose of the color coding? Emergency responders won't be able to see it easily." "That's a fair point," Harold acknowledged. He turned to Patricia. "What if the screening was designed to allow visibility for emergency purposes, but reduce the visual impact from the street?" "I don't see how that's possible," Patricia said stubbornly. One of the other board members, a man named Frank Torres, spoke up for the first time. "What about a partial screen? Something decorative that blocks the view from the street but leaves the sides open. Emergency responders could still access it and see the color coding, but casual observers wouldn't notice it as much." It was the first reasonable suggestion anyone from the HOA had made. I looked at Lauren, who nodded slightly. "I'd be open to that," I said. "As long as the color coding remains visible and accessible, I'm fine with some kind of decorative screening." Patricia started to object, but Robert Devereaux put a hand on her arm and whispered something in her ear. She pressed her lips together in a thin line but didn't speak. Let's explore this option, Harold said. What would this screening look like? We spent the next hour discussing details. Frank suggested a desert-themed decorative wall, maybe 3 feet high, with native plants around it. The wall would run along the street-facing side of the tank but leave the other sides open. The tank would still be fully visible from my backyard and from the sides, but someone driving by on the street would mostly see the decorative wall and landscaping. The tank stays red and yellow, I insisted. That's non-negotiable. But it's partially screened from street view, Patricia countered. That's non-negotiable from our side. Harold looked between us. Can you both live with this compromise? I looked at Victor, who gave me a small nod. It wasn't perfect, but it addressed both concerns. Yes, I said. Patricia took longer to answer, but finally nodded stiffly. Fine. Harold drew up a mediation agreement on the spot. The HOA would approve the decorative screening plan, waive all fines that had been assessed, and allow the tank to remain painted red and yellow. I would install the screening within 60 days at my own expense, though I could choose the specific design as long as it met the general parameters we discussed. Everyone signed the agreement, though Patricia's signature looked angry, if that was possible. As we left the mediation center, I felt exhausted but victorious. It had been a long, stressful battle, but I'd stood my ground. You did good, Victor said, shaking my hand. Most people would have given in and painted it beige. You stood up for what was right. I hope this is the end of it, I said. It is. The mediation agreement is binding. The HOA can't come after you for this again. Lauren and I drove home in relieved silence. When we pulled into our driveway, I looked at my bright red propane tank with its yellow safety stripes and smiled. The next week, I met with a landscaper named Maria Gonzalez to design the decorative screening. She had some great ideas for incorporating native plants and natural stone to create something that actually looked better than the bare tank had. I can make this really beautiful, Maria said, sketching out ideas on her tablet. Desert willows here, some agave plants here, and we'll use this beautiful sandstone for the wall. It'll blend with your outdoor kitchen perfectly. How much is this going to cost? For materials and labor, probably around $3,000. It was more than I'd hoped, but less than I'd feared. And it would finally put this whole nightmare behind me. Maria started work 2 weeks later. True to her word, she created something genuinely beautiful. The low sandstone wall had a curved, organic shape that complemented the desert landscape. The plants she chose were native species that required minimal water and would thrive in the Arizona heat. When she was finished, the tank was still fully visible from my backyard and accessible from the sides, but someone driving by would see an attractive desert garden feature instead of an industrial propane tank. I took photos of the completed work and sent them to Victor, who forwarded them to the HOA as proof of compliance. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 months later, I received another violation notice in the mail. My heart sank when I saw the HOA letterhead. What now? I opened the letter and couldn't believe what I was reading. Patricia was citing me for having unapproved desert landscaping and failure to maintain approved plant species. According to the letter, the desert willows and agave plants Maria had installed weren't on the HOA's approved plant list. I immediately called Victor. She's doing it again. She's harassing me with a different violation. Victor sighed heavily. Forward me the letter. This is getting ridiculous. I sent him the letter, along with photos of the landscaping. An hour later, he called me back. I checked the HOA's approved plant list, Victor said. Desert willows and agave are both on it. This violation notice is completely bogus. So what do? We document everything. This is starting to look like targeted harassment. Save every letter, every email, every interaction with Patricia or the HOA. If this continues, we may need to file a harassment complaint. I did as Victor advised, but I was getting tired of constantly fighting with the HOA. Lauren and I had several conversations about whether we should just sell the house and move somewhere without an HOA. I love this house, Lauren said. I love the neighborhood. I love our neighbors. I don't want to let Patricia drive us out. But how long can we keep fighting? I asked. As long as it takes, Lauren said firmly. We're not the ones in the wrong here. I responded to the bogus plant violation with a detailed letter explaining that all the plants were on the approved list and attaching screenshots from the HOA's own website showing their approval status. I sent copies to all the board members, not just Patricia. A week later, I received a call from Frank Torres, the board member who'd suggested the screening compromise during mediation. Yates, I owe you an apology, Frank said. I didn't realize Patricia was still going after you. The violation notice she sent about your plants was never approved by the full board. She sent it on her own. She can do that, I asked. Technically, no. Board actions are supposed to be approved by majority vote. I've talked to the other board members, and we're concerned about how Patricia has been handling your situation. Several of us think she's taken this personally and is abusing her authority. This was interesting. What happens now? We're calling for a special board meeting to review her actions. Would you be willing to attend and present your side of things? Absolutely. The special board meeting was held in the community center on a Tuesday evening. I brought Lauren with me for moral support, along with all my documentation of every interaction with Patricia and the HOA. The room was set up with a table at the front for the board members and rows of chairs for residents. I was surprised to see that the room was nearly full. Apparently word had gotten around that something interesting was happening. Frank called the meeting to order. Besides him and Patricia, there were 3 other board members. A woman named Sharon Kim, a man named Dale Morrison, and another woman named Judith Palmer. We're here tonight to review some concerns that have been raised about HOA enforcement actions, Frank began diplomatically. Specifically, we need to discuss the handling of violations related to Mr. Yates Zanders's property. Patricia's face was already flushed with anger. This is highly irregular. Board business should be conducted in private. According to our bylaws, special meetings can be open to residents, Sharon Kim said, consulting a document in front of her. And given the nature of the concerns, I think transparency is appropriate. Frank invited me to present my timeline of events. I stood up and walked through everything. The initial propane tank painting, Patricia's first violation notice, the fire marshal's letter, the mounting fines, the court hearing, the mediation agreement, and finally the bogus plant violation. I want to be clear, I said. I have no problem following legitimate HOA rules, but I do have a problem with being harassed and targeted with fake violations because the HOA president doesn't like that I challenged her. Patricia stood up angrily. That's defamatory. I have never targeted anyone. I've simply been enforcing the covenants as written. Then, why did you send a plant violation notice without board approval? Dale Morrison asked. Frank showed me the bylaws. You're not supposed to issue violations unilaterally. It was a minor administrative matter, Patricia said dismissively. It resulted in a formal violation notice threatening fines, Sharon Kim said. That's not minor. The meeting devolved into a heated argument among the board members. Patricia insisted she'd done nothing wrong and was just doing her job. The other board members increasingly challenged her authority and questioned her judgment. Finally, Judith Palmer spoke up. She'd been quiet until now, just listening and taking notes. I've been on this board for 3 years, Judith said. And I've watched Patricia become more and more controlling. This situation with Mr. Zanders is just the latest example. He did everything right. He followed fire safety standards, got approval from the fire marshal, went through mediation in good faith, and completed the agreed-upon screening. And what did Patricia do? She came after him again with a fake violation. It wasn't fake, Patricia protested. The plants are on the approved list, Judith said calmly. I checked, so yes, it was fake. And that makes me wonder how many other residents you've targeted with questionable violations. A murmur went through the room. Several residents raised their hands, wanting to speak. Frank sighed. I think we need to open this up for resident comments. What followed was an hour of residents sharing their own stories of questionable HOA enforcement actions. A woman named Denise talked about being cited for her mailbox color, even though it matched her house. A man named Robert described being fined for parking his work van in his driveway overnight, even though he had a medical condition that made it difficult to walk from the street. A young couple named Jason and Amanda explained how they'd been cited for having children's toys visible in their backyard, which they argued was ridiculous since backyards weren't even supposed to be subject to HOA oversight. The pattern was clear. Patricia had been using HOA enforcement as a weapon against anyone who didn't meet her exacting standards or who had challenged her authority. By the end of the meeting, the board took a vote. Patricia was removed as president by a 4-1 vote, with only Patricia voting against her own removal. Frank was appointed interim president, and the board committed to reviewing all outstanding violations to ensure they were legitimate. Patricia stood up, her face contorted with rage. You'll regret this, all of you. I've kept this community beautiful and maintained our property values while the rest of you did nothing. You're going to run this place into the ground. She stormed out of the community center, slamming the door behind her. The room was silent for a moment, then someone started clapping. Soon the entire room was applauding. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. After the meeting, several residents came up to thank me for standing up to Patricia. You did what the rest of us were too scared to do, Denise said. I just paid the fine for my mailbox because I didn't want the hassle. You shouldn't have had to fight this hard to do the right thing, Jason added, but I'm glad you did. Frank approached me as the crowd was dispersing. Yates, I'm sorry you had to go through all this. The board is going to review our enforcement policies and make sure nothing like this happens again. I appreciate that, I said. I just want to live in peace and maintain my property safely. That's all any of us want. And from now on, that's how we're going to operate. Over the next few weeks, things settled down. Frank proved to be a reasonable and fair board president. He sent out a newsletter to all residents explaining the changes to enforcement policies and inviting feedback on the HOA's rules and procedures. My propane tank remained red and yellow, partially screened by the beautiful desert landscaping. The outdoor kitchen became the neighborhood gathering spot, with Lauren and I hosting regular barbecues for our neighbors. One evening, about 4 months after Patricia's removal, I was grilling steaks for a group of friends when Dominic stopped by to check on the propane system. How's everything working? He asked, inspecting the connections and gauges. Perfect, I said. No problems at all. He looked at the bright red tank with its yellow stripes and smiled. And the HOA, new management, I said. Much more reasonable, good. You know, I've been installing these systems for 15 years, and you're the first client who's ever fought for proper color coding. Most people just give in when the HOA complains. That's depressing, I said. It is, but it's also why education is so important. People don't understand that these color codes exist for a reason. They think it's just a suggestion or a preference. They don't realize it could mean the difference between life and death in an emergency. His words stayed with me. I'd been so focused on fighting the HOA that I hadn't thought about the bigger picture. How many other people were being pressured to ignore safety standards because of HOA aesthetics? I decided to do something about it. I wrote a detailed article about my experience and submitted it to the Arizona Republic, the state's largest newspaper. I didn't expect them to publish it, but a week later, I got a call from a reporter named Isabel Martinez. "Mr. Zanders, I'd like to do a story about your experience with your HOA," Isabel said. "I think it raises some important questions about how HOAs handle safety issues." She came to my house and interviewed me for over an hour, taking photos of my propane tank and the decorative screening. She also interviewed Fire Marshal Whitmore, Victor Chen, and several of my neighbors. The article ran on a Sunday with the headline, "Scottsdale Man's Fight for Fire Safety Reveals HOA Overreach." It detailed my entire experience and included comments from fire safety experts about the importance of proper hazard identification. The response was overwhelming. I received dozens of emails from people around Arizona who'd had similar experiences with their HOAs. Some had given in and painted their tanks beige. Others were currently fighting similar battles. A few fire marshals from other jurisdictions reached out to thank me for raising awareness about the issue. The article also caught the attention of state legislators. A representative named Kevin Sullivan contacted me about testifying before a legislative committee that was considering HOA reform legislation. "Your case perfectly illustrates why we need clearer standards about when HOA rules must yield to safety considerations," Representative Sullivan explained. "Would you be willing to share your experience with the committee?" I agreed, and a month later, I found myself in a committee hearing room at the Arizona State Capitol in Phoenix. The room was formal and intimidating, with high ceilings and rows of seats facing the legislators' raised platform. I presented my story to the committee, explaining how the HOA had tried to force me to violate fire safety standards and how only persistent fighting had resulted in a compromise. I brought visual aids, including photos of my propane tank and copies of the fire marshal's letter. Fire Marshal Whitmore also testified, explaining the importance of proper color coding and hazard identification. He shared statistics about emergency response times and how quickly identifying hazards could save lives. The committee members asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely concerned about the issue. Several shared stories they'd heard from their own constituents about HOA overreach. 6 months later, the Arizona legislature passed new HOA reform legislation. Among other provisions, it specifically stated that HOAs could not enforce aesthetic rules that conflicted with fire safety standards or recommendations from fire officials. The law also created a clearer process for residents to challenge HOA violations and imposed penalties on HOAs that issued frivolous or retaliatory citations. Governor Katie Hobbs signed the bill into law, and I was invited to attend the signing ceremony. It was surreal to watch something that had started with a simple propane tank turn into state law. "You should be proud," Lauren said as we drove home from the ceremony. "You didn't just solve your own problem, you helped a lot of other people too." She was right. Over the following months, I heard from numerous Arizona residents who'd used the new law to push back against similar HOA demands. Fire departments around the state began educating residents about proper color coding, and HOAs started being more careful about their enforcement actions. As for Patricia, I rarely saw her anymore. She'd become reclusive after her removal as board president, and rumors circulated that she was planning to sell her house and move to a different community where she could start fresh. One day, about a year after the whole ordeal began, I was working in my backyard when I saw Patricia walking past on the sidewalk. She glanced at my property, her eyes briefly landing on the red and yellow propane tank visible above the decorative screening. For a moment, I thought she might say something, but she just pressed her lips together and kept walking. I turned back to my outdoor kitchen, where I was preparing for another neighborhood barbecue. The afternoon sun was warm, the grill was heating up perfectly, and my properly color-coded propane tank was functioning flawlessly. Life was good. And more importantly, my home was safe. Looking back on everything that happened, I learned some important lessons. First, HOAs have a lot of power, but they're not above the law. Second, safety should always take precedence over aesthetics. And third, sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's exhausting and expensive. I also learned that I wasn't alone. The overwhelming response to my story showed that countless people struggle with overzealous HOAs that prioritize appearance over common sense. The new state law wouldn't solve every problem, but it gave residents better tools to protect themselves and their families. Frank continued as HOA president and proved to be excellent at the job. Under his leadership, the Sonoran Hills community maintained its beautiful appearance while also respecting residents' rights and safety considerations. Enforcement actions were now decided by the full board, not one person, and residents had a clear appeal process if they disagreed with a violation. The community actually became more cohesive after Patricia's removal. Without the constant threat of petty violations, neighbors felt more comfortable gathering and socializing. My backyard barbecues became regular events, and other neighbors started hosting their own gatherings. On the 2-year anniversary of first painting my propane tank, I stood in my backyard with a beer in my hand, watching the sun set over the desert mountains. Lauren came up beside me and leaned her head on my shoulder. "Any regrets?" she asked. I thought about it. The stress, the legal fees, the hours spent documenting everything and fighting the HOA. It had been a difficult time, no question. But then I thought about the new state law protecting other residents. I thought about the fire safety education that had spread throughout Arizona because of the publicity. I thought about all the people who'd reached out to thank me for standing up to HOA overreach. "No," I said, "no regrets." My propane tank remained bright red with yellow safety stripes, a small but visible reminder that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do. And that's a lesson worth remembering.